Just to kind of introduce the panel, this is our second panel on the election year and sanctions policy. Some of the panelists you might remember are Barbara Baer from CMS and Sue Miller from Siemens and Harvard in the UK. We also have joining us Tim O'Toole, the head of our sanctions and export controls group with Lily Chevalier. And Dara Fernandez Perez is joining us virtually. And I just want to give a minute, Dara, if you want to introduce yourself, comment a little bit.
Sure. Sure. Hi guys. I would much rather be in DC right now than in the Canary Islands, which is where I'm calling from. My name is Dara Fernandez, and I'm the General Counsel of Sanctions for Honeywell Group. And I have the fortune of doing that role with global coverage out of the UK. So I'm London based. So very nice to meet you guys. And good to be with you, Tim, again.
And you too, Dara. And I think you might have just set a world record for being the first person to ever say, I wish I was in DC and not the Canary Islands.
It's the nerd in me. It's the nerd in me.
Just as a reminder for the attendees, this panel is being held on the Chatham House rule. So no statements should be attributed to the individuals who are speaking today. To get started, I think this is a big topic. U.S. elections, EU election, UK election, their impact on sanctions policy. I think it might help to start at a high level and then sort of work narrower from there. Right now, we're looking at a presidential election that's looks like basically a coin flip at this point as to whether it'll be a Trump administration or a Harris administration. Anyone who's been around, not under Iraq the last several months, can see that these are two potential administrations that have very different personalities and tones and different views of the world, and also very different views probably of how they view sanctions. And so I would like to start with Tim, just at a high level. How do you, if you were to kind of encapsulate how these administrations, you think, look at sanctions, look at alliances, and look at trade policy as it relates to sanctions, how would you kind of sum up those?
Sure. Well, thank you, Manny. And thanks everybody for coming. This is, I think we're going to have a good discussion. I know that Laura Deegan and I yesterday, I think, recorded a podcast that was directed to this subject as well. So we got into the weeds, but I think we'll go high level today. And I think if there were one word to describe the difference between the Biden administration and which I think the Harris administration is likely to continue in some sense, and there's even an overlap to some extent in personalities. So Brian Nelson, who has been essentially the political head of the part of Treasury that is responsible for OFAC, is now moved immediately when the vice president became the nominee to the Harris campaign. So I think that tells us most of what we need to know as to where sanctions policy will likely be under a Harris administration. It'd be about where it is now. The Biden approach was multilateralism. The Trump approach in the first Trump administration and what would be the second Trump administration, I think would be unilateralism, right? President Trump takes the position that America should come first and only. And so what our allies think is nice to know, but we're going to do whatever we want. And I think that was what we did in the first Trump administration, particularly with respect to Iran, but also with respect to Venezuela and Cuba to some extent, and not as much with respect to Russia. But I think with respect to Russia, that's because Congress passed a law in 2017 while President Trump was kind of newly in office that basically tied his hands in terms of changing the approach to Russia. But so I think that, with President Trump coming in another time, that will be probably the first question that would come to the fore is, well, what will happen with Russia, where we spent the last hour talking about this incredible multilateral approach that the current administration has taken and that has been, by all accounts, as successful as a sanctions policy can be. And I mean, I think that the one area where I think both sides agree is that sanctions is their primary approach to foreign policy. And we probably won't talk about it much on these panels today, but sanctions do have limits in terms of what they can and cannot do. But I think despite those limits, both a President Trump and a President Harris, I think, would agree that sanctions is going to be their primary approach to a foreign policy crisis. But how they would proceed in terms of implementing those sanctions, I think will be very different, because I think a President Trump will, if the second term is anything like the first, decide that this is the crisis and here's what we're going to do, and then would tell the allies about it afterwards. And a President Harris would say, this is the problem, consult with the allies, and there would be much more of the sort of multilateral approach that we saw discussed in the last panel.
That's great. And Sue, I guess there are obviously recent elections in the UK and the EU. So starting with Sue, I guess, are there some early signals you're seeing, some takeaways for people in the United States to see, like, how the UK is approaching sanctions, how they're viewing it, and maybe how they, any potential reactions to it, Harris or Trump?
So my first point is that Keir Starmer is a human rights lawyer. He has indicated his continuing support for Ukraine. I don't think there's going to be any change there, whether it's Harris or Trump administration. What I think is going to be interesting is that I expect his government to take a more considered position in respect of the sale of assets for the benefit of Ukraine, because there are clear human rights issues in relation to the seizure of private individuals' assets. He might take a much more relaxed view in relation to the seizure of state assets. And as a lawyer, I expect him to be more careful regarding targeted sanctions, in the sense that, you have to have some kind of off-ramp, or at least an effective way to remove sanctions if there is a resolution, the behavior changes. We know from the experience of the JCPOA that sanctions are really easy to impose, but almost impossible to lift. And it seems to me there's been little discernible focus on this in the mind of the policymakers to date, actually.
So from the EU perspective, I guess, I know there's a spectrum of members in different states. I guess, what are some early takeaways from elections in the EU?
In the EU? I mean, we've been very lucky that even though we are having tensions in all over Europe, that in the end the result was not too left and not too right, and we think it will not have an influence on the EU sanctions regime.
Is there a way in the EU, because there are so many members and they obviously have their own enforcement mechanisms that are more local, is there a way that we can understand the spectrum of the EU members and where they stand on these issues? Because obviously the EU as a whole has to get consensus on what they want to do. But are there sort of holdouts that are the holdout countries that are really dragging their feet when it comes to sanctions, and then the more hawkish countries? I think this is important for people to understand, because enforcement is at a local level.
Yeah, I mean, not so much. You would see that like Italy and Hungary isn't. I mean, they still have to apply it, the EU laws, and if they don't want to enforce it, they wouldn't have a chance to get away with that, because I mean, in the end, they would get their infringement proceedings of the commissions and then had to go back. But in the way they interpret the law, they're a little more relaxed, I'd say.
Are they the more sorry?
And I would think that if I look at Hungary, that maybe they have Mr. Orban has a different agenda, but I mean, there is the consensus. You have so many parties, and so him alone will not bring us into, as long as he stands alone, he won't bring us into a very difficult situation unless he says he wants to leave the European Union.
Thank you, that's helpful. I think, Dara, I wanted to ask you just to get your perspective. What are the things that are giving you, I guess, when it comes to sanctions, anxiety about a Trump administration versus a Harris administration?
well, putting political views aside, which which is hard with how polarized that potential outcome would be, I think that unlike the time when the UK was when Brexit was finally going to be implemented, and we were very scared of what was going to happen overnight and what was going to happen the next day. I think when it comes to the US election, there probably will be changes. And I totally agree with what Tim has said about the different approach, even if the process or the way to look at sanctions, in essence, will be the same. It'll continue to be a diplomatic tool to try to resolve conflict or create conflict, however you want. But on the basis of their perception of national security, well, in any event, that's a long-winded way of saying I don't think we're at the verge of what happens tomorrow after the election, but I do think that there will be changes. I don't really know what the changes are going to be. So the only thing I can do for now is continue to watch trade trends and continue to watch what the geopolitical environment is beyond the United States and try to understand who's ordering what are the commodities that are moving around, what is my supply chain telling me, and kind of be ready and have my ear on the ground for what I'm seeing that trade to be. And I know that might not be a super helpful answer, but I guess it's one of, I don't expect things to change overnight. I don't expect things to move drastically in a very short period of time, but they will inevitably, I think if we have a Trump administration, they will change. The priorities will change. The style will probably change. The collaboration across the world, across the Western world, will probably change drastically. If we have a Harris administration, I totally agree with Tim. I think it'll be more of a continuation of that multilateral approach. So I think what the only reasonable thing I can do is, like I said, keep watching the trade trends more so than the election. And then once the election happens, start thinking or start keeping an eye on how those, again, trade trends change. And doing it, to be fair, the way that we look at it or the way that I look at it is very much from a national security perspective. The laws are important and the regulations are important and they give us guidance. But the reality is that at the end, I end up using national security kind of as my North Star. So
that's helpful. I think that's sound advice, just keeping your ear to the ground generally.
Yeah.
At a time where there's going to inevitably be some sort of change over time.
Yeah.
To get more into the specific programs or areas where there are priorities for these administrations, I'm curious, again, starting with Tim and maybe hearing others, the reactions from the EU and UK. How do we, especially right now, there's probably a sanctions priority or geopolitical issue that's in flux is Iran in the Middle East generally. How do we view sort of maybe an approach from a Harris administration versus the Trump administration to what is currently a very destabilizing period in the Middle East, primarily with respect to Iran?
Yeah. So I've been given a lot of thought as to where a Harris and a Trump administration would come down with respect to Iran, especially in light of current developments. I mean, we have kind of the conflict, the fire in the Middle East that we've been worried about for years appears to be underway right now. I mean, we have Israel and Iran that are at war, essentially. They've been firing missiles at each other. And so that has been the worry. And Iran has been under sanctions now for 20 some years in the United States, maybe longer. And so what could either administration do to really increase trade pressure on Iran? It's very hard to figure that out. Now, I will say that, when the U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA, the Trump administration certainly increased sanctions on Iran considerably. I mean, they were all secondary sanctions, but they were increased. But I think that the Biden administration, after an initial attempt to kind of get back into the JCPOA failed, increased enforcement pressure on Iran to an extent that we hadn't seen before. So the Biden administration is enforcing the Iran sanctions more aggressively than I ever saw the Trump administration do that. And so I'm not sure where, this is kind of one of the principles that OFAC kind of tries to follow is always leave some room to increase when the political or the foreign policy situation increases. I mean, the foreign policy situation right now is about as high as I've ever seen it with respect to that region and with respect to Iran. But I'm really not sure where it is that the either administration could go to increase the sanctions pressure on Iran, because you have maximum sanctions and maximum enforcement. It's very tough to go beyond that. I think the only thing I would add is that does create this situation where potentially relief from those sanctions could be a bargaining chip to resolve whatever crisis is going on. But to Sue's point, once you put these sanctions on, it's very hard to pull back. And we saw that with the JCPOA, where you negotiated a deal, and with Iran, by all accounts, complying with that deal, we still put the sanctions back in place because they just wouldn't stay off. And so I think my only sense is that the sanctions now are at a maximum level, could be a negotiating chip, but negotiating with sanctions has proven very difficult, at least with respect to Iran.
Why do you think there's this perception, like you said, that the Biden administration has been very aggressive in terms of sanctions enforcement, and perhaps maybe there's some creativity in how they've been enforcing or what they've been targeting, and we can have you elaborate on that. But why does it feel like there's a perception that a Trump administration is so hawkish on Iran? So I think that's sort of in people's minds that Republicans are part of the image of it.
Well, to be fair, I mean, so President Trump ran in 2016 on getting out of the nuclear deal. He thought it was too soft on Iran, and he did it in 2018 after spending a couple years trying to talk about maybe getting a new deal that was tougher on Iran, which you can understand why the Iranians weren't all that anxious to back out of the deal so that they could have a worse deal. So they didn't. And so Trump backed out anyway, and at that point looked very tough, and then increased sanctions over the final 2 years of his term to a point that were well beyond where they were at the time of the JCPOA. So in that sense, he looked tough. By contrast, President Biden ran in 2020 on the idea that that policy had essentially allowed Iran to say, we're not going to follow the rules under the JCPOA, which the deal was sanctions relief, and Iran would scale down and essentially freeze in place or unwind its nuclear program. And that was, by all accounts, happening. And when President Trump pulled out of the deal, Iran eventually, originally the Europeans and the UK tried to hold Iran back and have them honor the deal. But once it became clear that the US was serious, Iran started rebuilding its nuclear program. So President Biden ran in 2020 on reviving the nuclear deal, right? So he was putting out the message that he wanted to talk and not get into an aggressive situation with Iran, because that situation had, in his view, caused Iran to restart its nuclear program, and that it was getting much closer to a nuclear weapon than it was before the deal went into place. And so they both took these tacks. One was kind of diplomacy, one was aggression. And so I think that's why President Biden is viewed as the diplomat, whereas President Trump is viewed as kind of the more aggressive one with respect to Iran. What's happened, though, is that the situation on the ground in Iran just fundamentally changed in 2022 with some of the human rights violations with respect to women in Iran. And the nuclear discussions broke down because there just wasn't the momentum on either side. And then Iran, elected a hardline leader who never really wanted to get back into the deal. And so President Biden has basically begun aggressively enforcing the sanctions in a way that we didn't see under President Trump, but it's been pretty quiet. Like, we know about it because we follow the designations. Sometimes we know about it because we're representing people or companies who are involved in enforcement actions that are kind of off the grid. But it is not a high profile strategy. When they ran under two different theories, and that's, I think, the public perception. But right now, the reality is that President Biden is as tough on Iran as President Trump ever was. But nobody really knows that.
Yeah, And so, Barbara and Sue, if you could both comment on just where the EU kind of fits in this, or what their views on this, and also maybe on a more on your day to day, some of these risks, even for non-US companies, are very real because of the secondary sanctions and other just additional designated parties. Have you seen this sort of play out in your own practice among your clients?
So I'll say I cut my teeth on the Iranian sanctions. I acted for the British Iranian banks when they were first designated. The truth of the matter is, when the JCPOA first came into effect, I think the UK and the EU got incredibly excited, but there was no trade because the banks wouldn't play ball. And so the reality is you can increase sanctions all you like, but Iran is pretty much insulated from them now. I think where it gets really difficult, and this is, it seems to me, a failure of the sanctions regime, is that we have now made Russia and Iran strange bedfellows. It's in their interest to work together. They're not natural allies. And, you know, if we had, if you think about it, during the JCPOA, and I did go to Iran 5 times between 2015 and 2018, which meant I had to apply for a visa rather than rely on the ESTA to come here. But, you know, the Iranians were desperate to deal with the Europeans, and we were in Europe at the time. We're still Europe, but we were in the EU. They didn't want to deal with Chinese. They didn't want to deal with Russians, but we have left them with no option.
I totally agree. I totally agree to that. And I would hope that we could all get back to the negotiation table in this regard, because it's very important. But if you look at the recent developments, the proliferation situation, then the idea of EU and their latest statement in this regard, it gets a lot more difficult. And I'm not sure whether we would have this proliferation situation if we weren't as strict with the Iran before. And we also have to avoid, if we look at it, that we are not forming new blocks out of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and things like that.
And Dara, this question, I guess, is for you on this topic of Iran, but I'm happy to have anyone else weigh in on this. Are you seeing sort of these new designations, particularly, I think, in supply chains, like in the maritime space, we're seeing a lot more designations. There have been at least a few high-profile instances where there's been asset forfeiture related to sanctions enforcement. Are these new anxieties? Are you feeling this from your end in terms of your supply chain risks and due diligence and whatnot?
Are you referring to designations just generally that impact or associated to secondary sanctions? Like, to be fair, it's all impacts the supply chain. And I think that's the short answer. I would add the fact that another problem I find is Iran being used as a transshipment country for diversion into Russia. And I think that's another aspect that we probably don't talk about as much. So yes, any designation that impacts supply chain, and right now with all the designations associated to Turkey, UAE, Chinese companies, that has a huge impact on supply chain. And fortunately, I'm in a very sophisticated company, and we have controls and we have a big trade group, but not every company has that luxury. And not every company comes from the US, where, you know, compliance practices are strict and there's a history of enforcement. So it's not just the designation in your supply chain that causes the issue. Is the fact that all the chains and all the links in your supply chain are not at the same level of sophistication and in the same background jurisdiction you're in. Therefore, you end up having to do quite a lot of teaching and quite a lot of maturity building for for parts of your supply chain. So I guess the short answer is yes.
So moving on, I guess, to the Russia sanctions program. Tim, you talked a lot about how the Harris administration probably would most likely look much more like the Biden administration in terms of multilateralism. The Trump administration is much more unilateralism. How do you think that that affects maybe the sustaining sanctions on Russia and what the priorities of the administration, these two different administrations would be? I'm also thinking about things that, especially just given that there's a foundation right now of multilateralism. What is it? There's the price cap, for example, is in some ways a concession, but it's also a very big multilateral effort. How does that look under a Trump administration?
So I do think that will be the biggest probably difference between a Trump administration and a Harris administration, is that a lot of the enforcement priorities will be a lot more difficult to achieve with a unilateral approach. And so you've seen, the G7 has come out with announcements about how the various enforcement agencies are going to work together to stop diversion. That is obviously a much more effective strategy, since a lot of the diversion efforts are going to at least begin or pass through some of the allied countries before they wind up going to Russia, just as a geographical matter. But I also think that if you don't have a multilateral approach, that it becomes, if your approach is kind of bilateral discussions, the diversion efforts affect our relationships with some of the countries in which diversion takes place. Now, they won't affect the relationship with Iran, as Dara's pointing out. Iran is a diversion hub to Russia at this point. But from the US standpoint, nothing should be going to Iran anyway. And so, there's still heightened sensitivity if things are going to Iran. But Turkey is a pretty large trade partner of the US. There's no prohibition on things going to Turkey right now. But Turkey is seen, I think, by the enforcers from a multilateral perspective as a potential diversionary hub for both Iran and for Russia. In a Trump administration, if the focus is on just bilateral relationships, Turkey may not be as interested in preventing diversion if it's just talking to the US as it is where it's talking to a united front among allies. And so how does that affect diversion efforts? Do countries like Turkey and the UAE and even other countries like China, where there's been a press to stop diversion efforts to Russia, do those efforts break down because the US just isn't interested in them anymore under a Trump administration, because this multilateral focus on diversion just doesn't become as big a priority? So you don't change the sanctions at all, but you change the enforcement in the sense that you can't work with other countries. That might happen. It might not. I mean, a lot will depend on where the Trump administration comes down as to how important the Russia sanctions are to US policy. If the Trump administration comes in and thinks, we want to continue Russia sanctions in exactly the same way they've been, we're just not going to work as closely with our allies on that, then perhaps those discussions with Turkey look very different than if they come in and say, there was this push in the Biden administration to really go after Russia from a sanctions perspective. We're not as interested in that at all, so we're not going to be as interested in diversion at all. Then I think that would look different. But I think in either sense, a Trump administration, I think the big initial test will be on how much of a focus do they put on diversion, because it's the key issue right now. I mean, we only really heard one substantive issue on the last panel in terms of current focus, and that's diversion. And I think that's consistent with what I'm seeing. But in a Trump administration, they might decide that that's not a focus. And so they don't change the sanctions at all. But if you change the enforcement focus, you really do change how the sanctions are, how effective they are from the outset.
So Barbara and Sue, I guess, likewise, I'd like to kind of get your comments on this and see maybe both of sort of gauging the temperature of how sanctions are sort of evolving under the new administration's leadership at the EU, and also just how you sort of see things going forward with some what you've seen since the elections?
So from a UK perspective, Boris Johnson made a big deal of going to Ukraine and being, Boris Johnson. In my view, he's a buffoon. But Keir Starmer has made it very clear that he is continuing to support Ukraine, and I don't expect it to continue to change at all. I think the UK and EU are aligned in that respect.
Yes.
But I do agree that if we have a Trump administration, which isn't that keen on enforcing the sanctions, they become toothless. Because neither the UK or the EU have really got the resources of OFAC to enforce, violations. And, just to give you an example, OFSI announced about 2 or 3 days ago that it had applied a penalty to a concierge service which provided services to Russian designated nationals. That resulted in a fine of £15,000. That's just pathetic.
Yeah, that's kind of a helpful illustration. I imagine, Barbara, I guess you sort of seem on the same page.
In this regard, yes.
So the next, I guess, area of focus or program I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on, Tim, in terms of Harris administration versus Trump administration, is with respect to China. I think when you hear them talk, in debates, in sort of speaking on the campaign trail, there's a lot of, it almost feels like they're trying to outdo each other in terms of identifying China as a threat. But I think that there's a lot of nuance underneath that and what that looks like. I'm wondering, too, if you could kind of preview what you think Harris administration would focus on versus Trump administration, maybe both in terms of targets and how they view the trade-offs that an administration would have to make when sanctioning a country that's as important to the U.S. as China.
So China will be really interesting, and I'll be curious to hear what Dara has to say, just because of the supply chain challenges that would be presented with respect to sanctions against China. But President Trump has not been shy about his feeling towards China and trade from the get-go, right? When he ran in 2016, China and trade was probably one of his 2 or 3 biggest issues. And it's been a big issue again. And one of the things we saw in the Trump administration was really for the first time an attempt to use sanctions as opposed to export controls, but they also used export controls, but sanctions to go after China. So they started the Hong Kong sanctions program while President Trump was in office. And there were some other sanctions against Chinese military companies that were put into place when President Trump was in office. And so they didn't adopt any sort of large-scale sanctions program when President Trump was in office, but really for the first time, there were sanctions against China in a way that we hadn't really seen before. I think in a second Trump administration, we might see more of that, in part because China just does seem to be something that President Trump is very concerned with, rightfully so. But I think that the thinking on the current OFAC and current Biden and potentially the Harris thinking on China is sanctions have limits, and China has a huge economy. I mean, it's the second biggest economy in the world, and the ability to impose sanctions against a country with the second biggest economy in the world would be, I think, to say the least, very challenging. I mean, we've seen with Russia that imposing widespread sanctions against the Russian economy, which is nothing compared to China, has been a challenge, and we've had to have a multilateral approach, and it's still got holes in it, and it's been, taken up all of our resources, all of OFAC's resources, and we don't have enough people to deal with the job, even when it's Russia. China is just too big to take on. It's like, the dog that chases the car. What do you do when you catch the car? And I think that's China. I mean, China is the car. You can chase it all you want, but if you start imposing sanctions, the resource issue becomes very significant. But I think we may find out what happens when we catch the car if President Trump takes office again, because I think that there would be a chance of kind of more widespread sanctions against China than we've ever seen with a Trump administration. I doubt we would see anything different with respect to a Biden administration or a Harris administration.
Is it fair to say that it kind of reflects a different view of just collateral harm from sanctions and the trade-offs?
Yeah, I mean, that's my sense is that, you know, imposing sanctions against Russia has had a huge amount of collateral consequences to the businesses who used to be in Russia. You know, we've worked with companies that got out of Russia and they left. The ones that got a good deal left at least half of their lost at least half of their assets in the process, and then spent another decent amount of money trying to get out, get the license that you needed from OFAC to get out. And those are the ones that succeeded. I mean, I could tell you stories about other clients that got out of Russia and basically just left everything there and got out and were lucky to do it. And so those sorts of collateral consequences would exist with a China sanctions policy, but you'd also have all sorts of other ones as well with respect to just the general grinding to a halt that happens whenever sanctions are in place, where essentially the banks are going, I mean, think of the compliance burden on a bank that is going to have to review every transaction involving China for sanctions risk. And even now, I mean, there's still quite a bit of review that's going on, but if you had widespread sanctions, you'd have all sorts of compliance costs and all sorts of over-compliance in the China sector that we're seeing in the Russia sector now. I mean, not every transaction in Russia is sanctioned, but every transaction between the US and Russia is reviewed to such an extent that you just have to assume that your transaction probably won't go through, even if it's completely lawful. Just if you imagine that with China, business would grind to a halt with the second largest economy in the world. And I think that's what OFAC has been scared of, quite frankly, in terms of thinking about putting sanctions in place in China, because China is engaged in many policies that from a US foreign policy perspective, the US disapproves of, particularly with respect to Xinjiang. But the imposition or the implementation of sanctions widespread sanctions with respect to China just hasn't been an option because of those collateral consequences.
And Dara, given all the messaging around this, I think it's hard to avoid. Are you seeing on your end is there any sense of or thought about preemptively, shifting supply chains or down risking your exposure to China in light of this, or are you sort of more of a wait and see?
Well, I think it's hard to just wait and see. I also think it's hard to try to predict. So where does that leave us? I think many companies have had risk assessments and stress scenario testing about supply chain changing, right? But I think that, as usual, Tim, you're right on the money, that once you catch the car is huge. What happens? And I agree on the unintended consequences to companies. Yes, of course, that's important. But more important than that is the unintended consequences to the public at large. And when you start changing some of these supply chain flows or these natural supply chain flows, you end up impacting negatively, usually the people with the least, with the least amount of money. And there's now plenty of research now going on as a result of the sanctions on Russia. And Russia, I don't think we realized just how many tentacles it had into critical infrastructure and critical supply chain. For example, most uranium either comes from Russia or is owned ultimately by Russian interest, which is necessary for the running of every public utility company in the West, right? So sanctioning civil use nuclear energy has a huge impact on people that have absolutely nothing to do with the conflict. So I think that when you extrapolate that to China, and it's not just the fact that it's a large economy, but it's a large economy and will have access to critical ingredients, critical components, critical raw material, critical infrastructure that will then impact the public at large. And I think that's to me one of the key scary parts of any wider sanctions on China, is just how that supply chain would be shaken. And I think that we didn't really anticipate just how much that would happen with Russia. And I think now we've seen what that impact is. Extrapolating that is very scary. But that doesn't mean that you don't do the exercise. I think everybody tries to do the exercise, but it's quite hard to try to find alternative supply.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I know from reading it from a U.S. perspective, it seems like there's been a lot of efforts by U.S. officials to kind of highlight China as a threat to the UK and the EU. I'm wondering how much that messaging is getting through, how much that's being adopted, particularly in the Netherlands, where I think advanced semiconductors are kind of the big issue there, and trying to get them to comply with U.S. export controls. I'm wondering if how much movement you see or how much momentum that has.
I'd like to make a different point first. The point that I'd like to make is that I don't think the US appreciates quite the impact of the Russian sanctions on the UK and the EU. The simple fact of the matter is that US didn't have that much trade with Russia. The UK, if you think about London, it was massively, just by virtue of being in the city and all of the money flowing around, London was massively impacted. Europe was massively impacted because Europe relied on,
think of Austria,
for all of its energy resources. So basically what we're talking about now is something that could potentially have the effect on the US that we've experienced in respect of the Russian sanctions. Just answering the question that you asked, in my view, what we've seen is a kind of sanctions by stealth, and they've done it by reference to export controls. So what we've seen in recent years is the UK has made China an embargoed country. So the consequence of that, under the export control rules, the consequence of that is that you need increasing requirement for end user checks. And, the reality that in most cases now you need to make license applications, even when you're not dealing with dual use or military use goods. And again, we've seen a real focus on emerging technologies. And, lots of those emerging technologies are coming from China. And so again, it's getting very restrictive.
And to be fair, just to add another comment, I think if there wasn't already Chinese technology in a particular subject, it's only increased as a result of the sanctions on Russia. So the lack of supply from critical technology from Europe and from the US has just given that extra credit point for the Chinese technology to be developed. So I think as an unintended consequence of the Russian sanctions, we've created a lot more capability in China for things that are critical technology that probably didn't have as many alternative suppliers as we're now seeing.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point to consider. And Barbara, I guess we're seeing an impact in the EU. Is there, since the last election, is there sort of a movement? Have you seen any sort of movement towards recognizing China more as a threat?
Yes, I'd say so, but I don't have the impression that the EU is currently interested in sanctions on China. I'm aware discussing tariffs and things like that, but we're not talking about sanctions, and we shouldn't. we shouldn't, because China is now close to Russia, and Russia found its friendship with Iran, obviously, and then it's just North Korea missing, and then we have a block that we should really avoid. And you can see this. If you look at the payment systems that they're using, you see who is joining. And one can see what they're doing, and we should avoid that. So it would be necessary to not have sanctions on China in this regard, by the same time having the sanctions on Russia and Iran, because I think that's dangerous than the other way around.
So you mentioned earlier that Keir Starmer is a human rights lawyer.
Yeah.
I'm curious, how do you see that reflected in sanctions designations in the UK?
I think it's early days. I think I'm going to make my comments about the decisions that have been coming out of the English courts, and I'm going to contrast them with the decisions that are coming out of the EU courts. So when we Brexited, I thought, well, at least the English courts will really consider the evidence, the designations, and will be more objective than the EU. But what's happened is that the English courts have just given extreme deference to the FCDR, Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, and basically said, oh, we actually think that the Foreign Office is the right entity to determine the levers of pressure. This is a nonsense. You have people who have been designated as associated persons because they're associated with an involved person, basically a designated entity, on the basis of marriage, on the basis of family relationship. And whereas the EU, in contrast, actually has said that is not sufficient. I find that, I find it really troubling. And I have done EU designation challenges in the past. And the reason that I was critical of the EU regime is that you would ask for the evidence, and quite often there would just be the grounds. That's all. You'd ask for the grounds, and you'd ask for the evidence, and you just get a piece of paper saying, Mr. X was designated for this reason. And you're like, I know that. I saw the grounds. But the deference that the English courts are giving to the decisions that are coming out of the FCDR is very worrying in my view. And
I guess I think this is an area, recognizing that UK and EU are relatively more nascent in terms of developing sanctions resources and programs. What do you think on the more subjective, substantive areas, like designating people for human rights violations? Where have you seen that sort of evolve in the UK? So my impression is that there's actually a high level of alignment here between all of the jurisdictions. Given the recognition of the Magnitsky-style sanctions. I mean, the only reason that the UK got interested is because of the poisoning of the Skripals. And, sorry, who was it? The previous female, not Liz Truss. Theresa May, that's the one. Right. She did a complete flip. She said, I do not believe in using sanctions as an encouragement to avoid human rights. We then had 2 incidents in a couple of years in the UK where people were targeted. And all of a sudden, oh, I'm interested in Magnitsky-style sanctions. But I think Keir Starmer, looking at the human rights priorities, I think he's going to be quite active. I think he will be very active in this area. And Barbara, are you seeing anything similar within the EU or in Germany?
No.
no appetite for.
No, it is just that there is discussions, but that's only on a very high level, and it's nothing that is planned in this regard, so directly or so don't see that.
And,
Or what did I get your question right?
no,
If there will something change with regards to.
yeah, there's been developments or motivations or sort of.
I mean, it is still a motivation. It was always a motivation, and it is still a motivation, but no specific change that I have in mind currently.
And Tim, I guess going to the US where there is sort of this more developed sanctions program focusing on human rights violations, how do you see maybe in the Harris administration, what their focus might be versus a Trump administration? Or the targets of these things are?
I haven't really heard a lot of discussion during the election that suggests that it's going to be as high a priority for President Harris as it was for President Biden. I mean, President Biden made very clear that he was going to focus U.S. foreign policy in part on foreign corruption. Now, we've seen that in the sanctions context. We haven't seen that as much in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act context. That is, we haven't seen as much FCPA enforcement under President Biden as we might have seen in the past, but we've seen a lot of designations. I do wonder whether or not that's really going to be the preferred U.S. route going forward. Designations are pretty easy. They're a lot easier than a long investigation and then a long negotiation and exchanging documents back and forth. You just kind of wave your magic wand, sanction somebody, and to Sue's point earlier, I mean, we don't have any protections here, at least not developed ones, with respect to challenging designations. That may change because I think the Supreme Court, our Supreme Court anyway, is undergoing kind of a sea change with respect to the powers of administrative agencies, and it may wash over a little bit into some of the powers even in the national security context. But for now, if you can wave your magic wand and kind of go after corruption without having to do a long investigation and justify what you're doing and provide the other side with evidence and lawyers and that sort of thing, it seems like that might be an easier way to do it. And so far, that's what we've seen under President Biden in a way that we hadn't seen before. And so that might, at least in part, explain why we're not seeing as many FCPA prosecutions, but why we are seeing a lot more global Magnitsky designations. I expect that would continue under President Harris, but I haven't heard as much during the campaign that would give me any reason to believe that.
With the few minutes we have left, I wanted to talk a little bit and ask you all a little bit about the dynamic I think you see between different branches of government. And specifically, I think if people reading the news about sanctions, you're often seeing comments from congressmen and senators about calling for more sanctions or calling for targeting of certain sanctions or enforcement. Dara, you mentioned that you're really constantly keeping your ear to the ground. How do you understand, given the limited powers that people in Congress have to just implement sanctions, how do you sort of interpret that? And how do you kind of think of this, thinking about where sanctions are going?
About the push for more sanctions as a general comment from government.
Yes, and just like that dynamic in the relationship between Congress and the presidency.
To be fair, I mean, I would say that I spend more time lately, especially talking to UK government than I do in the US, just by virtue of my geographic location. So I do think that what I'm finding in my conversations with government, whether it's through roundtables or whatever it might be, is that there's a desire to understand how to make the existing sanctions more effective. I find less push towards more sanctions and much more conversation about how do we make them do what we need them to do. There's a greater focus on how do we make sure that products don't get to the wrong hands. And so the conversations I'm involved in are usually more in that tone with government. Whether someone makes a flippant comment of, oh, we need more sanctions. I mean, that's all great, but you got to take it with a grain of salt, right? And see what the capabilities are. I mean, I think Sue was saying earlier how the latest enforcement action here in the UK was for £15,000. So I think that I'm very pragmatic about whether those comments coming from Congress are really having the impact on the true policymakers. And the true policymakers are the ones that where the conversation is very much focused on how do we make sure that the programs we have are having the right, how are we testing that they're having the right consequences and minimizing those unintended consequences. So that would be how I keep my ear to the ground, closer to the policymakers and probably a little bit further from Congress. But
Tim, would you agree with that approach?
Yeah, I mean, so my background before I worked in sanctions was as a public defender, and in the 1990s and 2000s, there was this big rush to like pass a new crime for everything that got on the news. You pass a new crime, and all of a sudden we had fast forward to 2016, 2020, we had both this mass incarceration problem, and everybody agreed we had a lot of crimes for things that really we didn't need more laws for. In my current day job, I'm seeing the same thing, 20 years later, where essentially you have sanctions policy where it's really easy to slap a new sanction on, right? It's a lot harder to figure out a way to both limit that to where it's really effective. And at least for what it's worth, I mean, my view is that sanctions can play a really important role in solving foreign policy crises if they're targeted at that crisis, and you don't have this sort of ratchet where you can always add more, but you can never go back. Because, and I think, for whatever you think about the politics, the Iran nuclear program was a good example of that. I mean, there was consensus that we didn't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. We imposed sanctions because they were trying to build a nuclear weapon, but we negotiated, and when they said that they would stop, verifiably stop the nuclear program, we started to lift the sanctions. And that's kind of, in my view, a good example of how sanctions can work. These like, let's impose sanctions for every foreign policy problem, and especially this kind of let's impose sanctions because we think there's a bad government, which is kind of the Cuba paradigm, where like we had a bad government in the 60s, and to be fair, like it was a bad government. There were lots of problems with it, but sanctions is not, at least in my view, a proven tool to really stop bad governments just writ large. Like it's not worked in Cuba, it's not worked in Venezuela. And so, if you think about like, can we limit sanctions to a discrete purpose? And then the hard work is in enforcement. Like once you have a sanction, how do you make it work? How do you make the sanction, give it teeth and make it change the behavior that you want to change? That's really hard work. It's not a matter of kind of passing more sanctions laws. It's a matter of kind of good police work, good investigative work, government kind of having a backbone and making sure that that is in place and is going to be pushed, and then massive resources. And so it's much easier to kind of just write down another sanction law, and it doesn't cost anything to do it. And so if you want to look tough, pass more sanctions laws. But if you actually want to be tough, figure out where sanctions work and put the resources there and put the effort there. And I'm not seeing the latter. And what that usually causes is just kind of a big mess. And that's kind of where I see things kind of currently.
That's helpful. Thank you. And do you, I guess, it sounds like from the earlier comments, just that if Trump is going down this certain road, it sounds like it is more slapping sanctions on, asking questions later. Do you think there'd be in the Trump administration a push for more resources?
Maybe. I mean, look, if President Trump decides that he wants to use sanctions to change particular things and then engage in negotiation, that might be an effective strategy. I mean, certainly slapping more sanctions on scares the target, because what we saw in Venezuela is a good example. I mean, sanctions crashed the Venezuelan economy. But to what end? I mean, Maduro seems as much in place now as he was before. And so we've got Venezuela with just this crappy economy and all of these consequences that Dara was talking about, where the people of Venezuela are suffering. but they're suffering both now with a crappy government and a crappy economy, whereas at least before they had a decent economy with a government that we didn't like, and for lots of good reasons. But if you want to now take that and negotiate with Maduro to try and get to a resolution that doesn't necessarily involve Maduro leaving power, because my sense is that most governments aren't going to negotiate their own demise. So you've got to figure out what's the goal beyond that you can get that would make the US happy. That might work. And in the same way with Iran, like I said this on the podcast and I've said this before, I think President Trump might actually want to negotiate a deal with Iran if he becomes president, just to prove that, if for no other reason, to prove that he can negotiate a better deal than President Obama did. And there is the potential for that. I mean, Iran has a more moderate president at this point. Things can't get much worse in terms of sanctions, but I think Iran probably has enough to deal with right now that it would be interested potentially in a deal. So that could happen. And so President Trump might have lots of opportunities to negotiate from these sanctions. But if he doesn't want to do that and he wants to kind of make the sanctions effective so that they can be a spur to change policy, I think we'll see if the resources go and if the kind of the roll up your sleeves and make sanctions work come into place.
Are there any questions from the audience? Any closing thoughts from panelists?
I have a question.
Sure.
I was just going to direct it towards Dara. Given Ballot and counsel, you are doing a lot of different risk scenarios, and I know you talked before about doing risk assessments on China, but is there any sort of internal thought with the company on mapping out what sanctions look like under different U.S. administration, particularly given that Honeywell is also there's the U.S. parent there.
I am so sorry. I think that was Laura speaking, right? But I couldn't hear what you said, Laura. So you might have to get closer to the mic because on the on.
Oh, sorry. No, it's
rephrase what I said.
So you should understand she's asking about risk assessments that Honeywell takes on as a company that's a subsidiary of a U.S. company in these different scenarios.
Yeah. So
in terms
which
of the election, like if you do any sort of gaming.
Right. So in terms of the election, are you kind of gaming that out? Is that in mind as part of any risk assessments right now?
Yeah. Oh, of course. I think Laura, at the end, we're even when we don't want to, we're constantly risk assessing. We're risk assessing individual transactions for the risks we see today, but for the risk also that we see medium and long term. We're setting up our program, trying to identify. So we're doing that naturally, just as part of that's what risk management is all about. But then when it comes specifically to the potential of the two different administrations, I am very lucky to have a very strong GR team that also helps me do some of that risk assessment. So the answer is yes, and particularly because of the areas that we play in, right, as Honeywell, where we're so involved in defense, in aerospace, in energy. I mean, we're in very critical industries that tend to be the focus of a number of economies. So yeah, we do, Laura.
Thank you for that question. So with that, I think I'll close and just thank our panelists for joining, and thank you, Dara, for joining us virtually.
Thank you, guys. Still maintain that I'd rather be in DC.
Well, we'd love to have you out for a drink on the porch, Dara, but you'll have to have one in the Canary Islands.
I might have to have one all alone in the Canaries. Have a great day, guys.
All right.
Thanks so much.
Bye.